Hello and welcome. Today we will take a look at the Game 5 draft in the T1 vs RNG series of the MSI finals. I will try to be as objective as possible, but let me know if I start cheering T1, right? But many of you already know the draft was bad and probably have some good ideas on why that is. Well, with so much going wrong, there are many things really jumping to mind. But I will go over 4 steps today in which T1 made some errors, which led to this extremely one-sided draft, leaving T1 with no real win conditions besides maybe a power outage in Shanghai. You can skip to a chapter if you want to go to some specific parts, and in the end, to respond to the comments of RNG fans 123, why don't you draft for T1 then? I will give you one example draft with which T1 might have had a chance. So stay tuned for that, but let's begin. Starting at step 1, RNG's comfort picks, scouting out what RNG picks, values and needs as a team and for the players as individuals. Looking at the champions RNG has played so far at MSI, we can see that for most players there are 2 champions that they value quite a lot and have played a shit ton of. This amounts to roughly speaking 10 champions for the entire team with 2 per role. Comparing that on the other side with the champions T1 has elected to play, we see that per role T1 is edging out, right? Zeros has played 9 to 7 of bin champions, Owner 9 to 8, Faker equals with Xiaohu on 9 to 9, Guma with 11 to 7, and Carrier, well, this guy he picked like 14 champions to Ming's 9. So on average you see T1 has more than 2 additional champions in their pool and as such has a more diverse champion pool, but we also see that they value similar champions in some positions, but overall have a larger spectrum of champions that they are viable on, and the eye test also goes along with that. Taking RNG's performances on these 1-2 champions per role into consideration, T1 first off has a potential strategy to ban out and counter these 10 champions. Obviously there's a limited number of bans and picks that you can get, so they should focus on the 5 most played champions, which actually have quite a large gap. If you see here their numbers, they are indeed quite larger than even the second most played champions, and the performance on these most played champions obviously also overshadow the performance on their second and third most played champions. Taking a look at this from the ban phase and trying to recontextualize what T1 did and did wrong in that aspect. T1 was banning Nautilus, Lucian and the Viego. So if we look back at RNG's most played champions, we see, okay, we have hit Wei, we have hit Ming. The Lucian, sadly at the moment, is a champion none of RNG has played, and that's because the champion currently or in that patch was quite strong, especially for a team like RNG which has flex potential, so this is a considered OP ban or power pick that has to be dropped. Now RNG obviously now 2 of their 5 one-trick ponies, if we want to call them that, have been taken care of. Now obviously 3 remain, Bin's Gwen, Kaiser for Gala, and before the series the Galio for Xiaohu. So considering the need for the Gwen for Bin to perform, this is the obvious choice for RNG. Why is this the obvious choice? First of all, if we take a look back at T1's Champions, we see no Galio and we see no Kaiser priority. So these 2 champions, even though RNG values them highly, T1 doesn't put them on the same pedestal. So RNG has less fear of T1 picking them away in the R1, R2 rotation. So T1 they respond with the Ari and Wukong combo, going for some Vestians or something. Like, I don't know, I don't play TFT, but obviously their idea here is they're not picking away RNG's power picks, which is, to be fair, a decent thought if you think about it. Gwen with Galio and Kaiser, that's a lot of AP damage and maybe not the way to go. But their power picks have shown to have counters that are already known to RNG and that are already high valued. Just a short look here for Xiaohu. Lissandra is his 3rd most played champion at the tournament, and Lee Sin, which can be considered a soft counter to Wukong, is Wei's 2nd most played champion. So in the end, this little peek here into RNG's champion pool, which might at the first glance look a bit bad and a bit weird, but they, maybe unintentional, maybe intentionally, turned this into a decently interesting weapon for the draft phase. Because if RNG has, let's say, 10 champions they play really well, T1 can only ban out a limited number of them. and if they decide to ban out one player in particular, this means the other 4 get their one-trick pony S-tier comfort champions, which are also quite nice. Additionally, if we look at RNG's champions, only looking at the most played champions here in the first and second column, we see that not only all of them are meta relevant, we also see that they work well together. Means RNG have drafted similar style compositions again and again with champions with similar themes and similar ideas. So while many people have flamed T1 for being one-dimensional in their picks and game approach, in truth RNG has done a similar thing but made great use of it due to high skill on each individual one-trick pony champion. Coming to part number 2 now, focusing on the counters to the one-trick ponies of RNG. The focus on this lies on the one-on-one, not on the comp or the identity of the champions. Starting in the top lane, we look at the Gwen, obviously very infamous and highly debated online if that was indeed the crucial pick to break T1. And obviously throughout MSI and throughout solo queue, people have invented some forms of counter picks which have worked to some various degrees. Looking at the player gap, obviously coming into this one-on-one, Zeus could have gone for different options. Ornn, for example, not winning in the 1v1, but being a potential bulwark against the Gwen split push, offering enough in team fights and obviously helping his team with scaling. Sadly though, for T1, Zeus doesn't seem to be the type to play tank champions yet. We have not seen too much from him besides some good Gragas performances earlier in the year. Another champion that has seen some form of play but didn't seem to be that popular would be the Vladimir. Played by Broken Blade and by Zeus himself to some success. This would have been an option, but obviously is not the strongest champion in itself. And then lastly, for counterpicks to the Gwen, the champion that I personally would have liked to see, that would be the Jax. Jax himself, we have seen it a lot, even from Zeus, again, obviously going alongside the champion pool of our T1 players here. Jax winning against the Gwen has been done multiple times. Looking at the other pick that been elected a couple of times, but obviously to lesser success. That would be the Gangplank. And Gangplank, well, he can be countered by different ways, through laning phase, throughout scaling. For example, the Ornn could have come in here as well, or a Gwen if left open. But also Irelia, a champion that Zeus has played, and obviously I love to see, would have been an option here. So we see that there are a couple of known counters that are also part of Zeus' champion pool for him to be ready to pick against Bin. Coming to the jungle, and let's take a look. We see that Viego, obviously waste one-trick pony if we're being honest, has been elected multiple times. T1 even elects to ban it, and there are certainly counters to him. One would be obviously the Blind Monk himself, beating him in the early game. Sure, there are issues later on, but that would have been an early game option. Owner obviously is also very familiar with. And in this case, we also saw the Lee Sin pick obviously coming in from Wei. So what would have countered him? Obviously the trusted Poppy, something Owner plays and was one of the first ones to bring it out. Also another pocket pick from Owner, obviously to varying degree, would have been a Vi. Lastly, the Monkey obviously has solid matchups into all of them, but wouldn't have been the best idea into Lee Sin or Viego due to the early game disadvantages he has against them. So we're coming to the mid lane and we all dread what we're going to talk about now, but let's start with some easy topics. Obviously the Galio, one of Xiaohu's most played champions, and T1 has shown obviously the Tristana as a counter pick. Issue with Tristana, obviously something you have to remember, it is an AD champion, so you have to get your AP from either the top lane or the jungle. So yeah, that's the little limitation on that pick. Then coming to the Ahri, still Xiaohu's most played champion and still a decently strong champion, don't get me wrong, no one says Ahri is weak. But Ahri's obviously completely dead counter would have been the Lissandra. I'm going to talk about that in the future of this video, so stay tuned for that, but obviously that's a counter. Lissandra also a champion Xiaohu has played and obviously elected in the series. What is an option T1 could have had to counter this? Well, there are quite a few, obviously to a varying degree of success and styles. Obviously we have poke champions that are out of range for Lissandra, something like the Corki or the Zoe, obviously AD or AP focus, and additionally as poke champions they need some other means of protection against engage from Lissandra. An option I would have personally liked very much would have been Sylas, being able to steal her ultimate and use it against her or her allies. Especially a champion like Lee Sin could have run into quite a few troubles. Also, Sylas' early skirmishing power is quite strong, and yeah, in solo queue it is regarded as a decent counter into that matchup. So we're coming to the bot lane, and the champion pool in the bot lane is quite diverse. There are a few AD carries that have been prioritized by both and are being played quite a lot. But let's see, Gala's obviously main champion always will be the Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa, there are a few options to tackle her, obviously with early aggression from a champion like a Tristana or a Caitlyn even in laning phase, right? Then another champion that he has played quite a lot and has been a contestant pick in the series for both Guma and Gala is obviously Xayah. Xayah obviously a very good champion against disengage, but champions with long range like Ezreal or Jhin, and again champions like Caitlyn or the Senna in later stages obviously do outrange her, and then her ultimate and E are not as strong. Another champion that Gala has played quite a bit is the Ezreal, and similarly to others, his early game weakness can be attacked by champions like the Caitlyn or the Senna to scale alongside with him. Another AD carry that has decent matchups into Gala's AD carries would be the Aphelios. Obviously he is depending more on team comp success and can't be a blind isolated answer, but in a meta with a lot of bruisers, Aphelios is actually kinda nice. So coming to the last and final position, the support role. Ming obviously a very good enthusiast of the Nautilus. So is Carrier, obviously we saw many of his good plays, but yeah, Leona also falls into his wheelhouse. Let's see what do these champions get countered by, and to be honest the portfolio is quite similar. Braum does well into both of them, and well against melee champions in general, Braum can be quite nasty with his slows. And not to mention that Braum also has some added benefits into champions like the Ezreal or the Xayah to block key projectiles with his E. Then obviously Tahm Kench, if you can't have the Xayah for yourself and the added safetiness of that, then a Tahm Kench with this Devourer can add you the safetiness and obviously counteract the engage of the supports. And then lastly we have Renata Glass as a counter-engaged support and ranged support bully in lane. So that's obviously a key pick for Carrier, specifically maybe to counteract the Ming aggression. Lastly here Karma as an example for ranged supports in general. Enchanters actually do quite well into some of the champions like the Leona and like the Nautilus, especially on this high level of play where we can expect people to, well, be a bit more careful than your solo queue Bonobo. A thing to mention with these last two ranged enchanter supports is obviously the fear of them setting up vision alone and getting caught. So with that in mind, the Tahm Kench and the Braum are some of the more easier to play champions in that setup. Now we know what RNG wants to play and what some counters are to these specific champions. Now some of them are quite powerful in the meta, and obviously there are a wide variety of champions not really in the meta and not in T1's tool houses yet that could have been elected. But we have been focusing on the surface level picks from RNG and the surface level counters that T1 has elected so far. Coming into the third step, the pick order. So for more details on this topic especially, check out my how to draft series on my channel. It goes about the different steps a team should take in the drafting process. You can click on it in the description or in the top right corner. You can find it there. But before we get into the step more, let's talk about some lingo that I'm going to use that you might not know or that might be new. Starting with the so-called match pick, where you pick a champion in the same role as your opponent. This is to not reveal other positions and to prevent additional counter picks. In line of a match pick is the counter pick itself, where you counter a selected pick from the opponent. Usually it's in the form of a lane counter pick, more so than an identity counter. You can also look to preemptively counterpick an opponent's champion if you know they're going to pick into them regardless. This can happen in the later stages of the draft where you know an enemy needs to draft a certain champion to flesh out their team composition. Next we come to the OP or power pick, and well, it is what it says. It's an OP or powerful champion in the current meta right now. Next we come to the well-known flex pick, and that's obviously a champion that can go into multiple positions and as such is not easy to counter. After that we go to the blind picks, and they follow a similar idea of champions that can't easily be lane countered. Lastly, we come to the so-called contested picks, and that is if both teams or two players really rely on one certain pick and both teams need it for their draft or for the player to succeed. Usually this is a bit of a bad thing though. Now with that in mind, let's see what RNG potentially did good and what T1 did bad here in the draft of game number 5. RNG obviously starts with locking in the Gwen in B1. This is a power pick, a blind pick and a flex pick. Obviously it can be played in the mid lane as well as the top lane, potentially even in the jungle and the mid lane. It is relatively hard to counter as many teams have not found too much success with the aforementioned counters, and is obviously very powerful and a comfort pick for Bin as a tiny on top of that. T1 in their R1, R2 rotation obviously picked the Ahri and the Wukong, which is something we already have molded about. And usually here on the R1, R2 position, you want to flex, match pick, counter pick, or have OP picks yourself. Obviously, with the intent to not get countered further, you want to match or counter the position already elected. Here we have a top laner elected, so you could elect another top laner and only show one additional position here at this stage, which potentially could be a flex or blind pick. T1 here, they elect two new roles, so to speak, a mid lane and a jungler, with their idea obviously here with Ahri and Wukong being exceptionally powerful right now in their mind. The problem here then comes for T1 that these champions have counter picks. So their problem is that they are not flex picks, they're not blind picks, and while they're certainly strong, a strong champion with counter picks already in the meta loses the value as a power pick or OP pick. As such, RNG responds with Lissandra and the Lee Sin, which obviously they are now matching the opposing roles. They're not revealing more of their comp in the support or AD carry position, for example. Obviously also ticking the boxes of RNG's comfort picks, which we've talked about before. Now they have elected two counter picks to the T1 champions and also got their comfort. RNG so far absolutely happy with their draft, and T1 not only countered in their power picks, also left comfort over and also revealed matchups unnecessarily. Finishing their first ban phase, they elect Jace as their option for the top lane. So far both sides have elected a complete top lane trio. Obviously the Jace is a counter pick into the Gwen, which was already revealed. Theoretically T1 could have elected this champion much earlier. Potentially swap this with the Ahri, which could have been a great idea because then you would have match pick top lane, showed jungle, which is a power pick which can be countered but only soft countered, and then RNG would have had to reveal another lane, and if they blind pick Lissandra, we already mentioned the counter picks. So just this little swap here doesn't make the draft all that much better, but would give T1 more power to play with in the remaining parts of the game and draft. We're obviously not talking about the bans. Not only were they decently fine in my eyes, and the thing with bans obviously also is we would open a completely new discussion about what could have been banned and prioritized instead, and that would also relate to mind games teams could have potentially done based on scrims on other intel that we don't really have. As such, I want to leave that be and only focus on the drafting sense in terms of champion selection. But before we move to the R4 pick, just a side note what the R3 pick could have potentially done, right? The R3 pick is quite special because bans follow right after it. So you can be a bit more brazen with this champion because you can ban away potential counter picks and even have R4 as a setup or continuation of this pick. So here with a strong identity champion in Jace, ignoring RNG's comp for now, you could ban away counters to this poke style and then follow up with poke support. They have elected here the Jhin, which so to speak has synergy with the Jace, with the Wukong, with the Ahri. We get to the concrete issues later in this video, but the idea of this champion is so far not too bad. Looking into RNG's champions, that's going to be a bit of an issue. Also the fact that Jhin is not in the best of spots meta-wise is not helping him here. RNG is rounding up their comp with a Tristana and a Rakan, obviously completing their skirmish, teamfight, mid-game comp with some more scaling, DPS and engage. So there's nothing really inherently bad or wrong with this. They're obviously aiming to counter some immobility with the engaged, adding DPS to their comp, potential scaling, turret destruction with snowballing, you name it. T1 now has the R5 pick, one of the strongest picks in the game, which obviously sees the entire RNG comp and is able to completely counter not only a specific champion, but the entire composition. Sure, it can also function in a way to completely bolster up the identity of T1's comp, but that is the advantage of this R5 pick. It can do whatever you need it to do in this spot. T1 elects Yuumi, which obviously at first glance looks weird, but let's get into some of the reasons now and later why that is. It is not a compositional counter to RNG's comp. It doesn't counter their hard engage or their bruiser style champions or their early game power. And in face of T1's comp, it looks more like a band-aid, to be honest. It tries to do a bit of everything that T1 likes and needs to do. As such, it tries to do a bit of everything, but ends up obviously doing nothing. It doesn't fix the draft and it doesn't fuck over RNG either. So if we look at T1's drafting decisions here, obviously the last two champions, starting with the most outrage, obviously over the Yuumi. The problem of the Yuumi composition wise is one issue. The problem of the Yuumi not doing anything for T1 as an R5 pick is another wasted potential of the red side, which in draft makes it a usually very strong side. The R4 Jhin pick, as we mentioned, is correctly used as a follow-up to the R3 pick. The R3 pick in itself, as Jace, looks fine into the Gwen. We ignore the matchups, but as an intended counter pick for the top lane. But then we come to the first rotation of potential power picks, which obviously in hindsight of the meta and hindsight of the champion pools aren't, and obviously fail in terms of drafting ideology, as there aren't match picks, there aren't flex picks, there aren't counter picks, and with highlight of champion pools, they aren't OP either. So simple change of Jace Wukong would not even help T1 with the champion quality they have elected, but the quality of electing champions would have already improved and would have potentially made the R3 pick way better. And if Jhin as a follow-up to the R3 pick could have also been something entirely different, not even talking about the disaster of the Yuumi fix all, fix nothing kind of situation we got into here. So now coming into the fourth category, which is styles. This also kept quite superficial to keep this video short, so don't get mad at me if I'm not talking about stuff like champion colors, which you can find out more in said playlist. If I'm not breaking down 2v2s, damage profile, item or level breakpoints, this is not what this is about. This is just a short glance over the identities and game styles these champions approach and why this is a potential mismatch here on T1 side, especially considering what RNG has drafted, and obviously also talking at this point what RNG has drafted to be correct, which obviously should have come through from part 3 now. Talking about the Ahri, obviously she is a pick champion, right? She's also a chase champion with the resets on her ultimate. She is a facilitator in terms of pick, and then her ability to chase down targets in team fights via resets. Wukong on the other side, it's a very simple and straightforward team fighting champion. Obviously some added notion comes that he is requiring his level 6, but that is about it. He obviously has some more nuances that we're going to get into later. Jace, very simple, is a poke champion that has a strong laning phase. Jhin here is very interesting because he is a very supportive AD carry, and he is supportive to the identities that T1 has already drafted, which I hinted at earlier. Obviously with his W and R, he can support pick comps. With his R slows, he can also support teamfight engages, and with his ult and W follow-up, he can also support poke comp. So we see he has some variety and things that he can do and support, but again, if you do too much of something, you end up doing next to nothing. So obviously he needs support to really excel at the different options that he can fulfill. Lastly, we come to Yuumi, which is also very straightforward. She is mostly based around team fighting. Obviously, she can counter poke combos with her heals. She has chase down potential with the slows of her Q and her R, but mostly her kit revolves around team fighting, healing your hyper carries, helping them peel, or helping bruiser engaged champions engage forward with the movement speed and the old routes. So overall, like we talked about the R4 and R5 picks, T1 is committing to everything but nothing. I now hear some of you crying out about diversity or some form of toolbox where they can adjust to whatever they need to some certain game states. But let's talk about some of the issues these champions have with each other and in general, and especially looking at RNG. Starting with Ahri. Obviously, as a champion you have some needs to be able to fulfill your role, to be able to do what you're drafted for. Obviously Ahri, she needs mid pressure to roam and set up for vision control, which then leads up to picks. The issue here in this matchup versus Lissandra is the constant TP disadvantage due to the need for cleanse. Also, the lane counter makes it so that she has no agency over the mid lane and the area around it, so she can't set up for roams or vision leads. Following is obviously the monkey. He needs some follow-up, mostly damage for the team fights. Stable lanes would be a nice thing as well, because he aims to farm fast to level 6 to then have impact in skirmishes. The issue in this game is that his follow-up in terms of CC or damage in team fights is rather limited. Yuumi ultimate or Jace Q are really the only really explosive damage tools with next to no follow-up DPS, right? Even if Jhin is opening up with his curtain call and hitting some 4th shots, or Ahri is hitting the return part of her Q. That is not enough DPS, especially not against the bruiser-like comp that RNG has drafted. Add to that he has some volatile lanes, which we already talked about, the mid lane power vacuum that's going to be occurring due to that matchup, and as such Wukong is going to be on a constant back foot in the 1v1 matchup against Viego, and occasionally has to try to bail out his lanes. Coming to the top lane, Jace, obviously he needs some setup for his laning phase. He needs to be able to push and have agency to attack the enemy champion's health bar and the turret. For that, he needs obviously some sort of jungle mid lane pressure to be able to control the topside river. Later on he needs safety and vision to poke effectively. Obvious issues fronting him here is the limited lane power. Obviously till level 6 Jace's lane versus Gwen is quite good. Wins 1v1s, has kill pressure, all that good stuff. Afterwards he's getting outscaled and out 1v1'd quite fast. Add to that for the teamfight and grouping stage that he has no protection for the engage or the CC. Add to that there are also some strong anti-poke abilities like dashes and Gwen's W to further detriment his impact in the later game stages. Moving to Jhin, we already talked about a bit about him. He needs poke, for example, to follow up, peel for him to be able to open up from range with his ultimate and to space correctly in team fights. Also, as he's a more burst heavy centered AD carry, he needs other damage threats to dish out some damage so he can execute, and also to limit the focus of him being the target of engage due to his immobility and lack of individual safetiness. Obvious issues here are no R follow up, next to no W setup for him, no protection, and no other real DPS threats that RNG needs to take seriously. So he's in no realistic position to do damage, to set up with his ultimate, or to be set up for his own pick potential. Finishing with the support Yuumi, obviously she needs some form of hyper carry AD carry or carry bruiser junglers. We obviously saw something like Olaf in the past. So in general, scaling and slower fights are also more to her liking, because obviously her W rotations then can come up more often, and her ultimate will also have more value than in contrast to explosive fights. Issue is she doesn't have a hyper AD carry or hyper carry in general. The monkey is also not the best bruiser to really team up with. There are also no lanes for her to buy time to scale into this late game hyper healing cat. Next problem is the damage profile of RNG is quite explosive and burst heavy. And then putting the final nail in the coffin for Yuumi and the problems of her team again, less vision because your support Yuumi can't roam around on her own to set up vision control, which obviously is another hindrance to safety and scaling and the other poke and pick focused members of her team. On the other side, if we want to take a look at RNG's comp, we see very bruiser-like, very skirmish heavy, very teamfight orientated. Comfort tools for most of their players, reset tools to keep the snowball and the team fights winning, relatively sturdy champions in their core, also high mobility across the board, which obviously is also good against the poke and pick from T1. They have a cohesive identity with also some diverse strengths in this microcosm of a comp. They have scaling in some champions, while also having early effectiveness on others. They have spikes on 1, 2 and 3 items depending on different champions, and overall it's a very solid composition. Power from early to late, they can obviously teamfight and even split push if necessary. Only issue would be the lack of wave clear potentially. So with T1's comp identity in mind, let us take a short look at how team comp identities usually pan out against each other. Starting with the classical teamfight comp, well, it does what we expect it to do. It beats out pick comps. You can imagine it like 5 players, 5 fingers, all sticking together, running around on the map. And well, the pick comp, they are looking for the one finger that is standing out, but well, in the teamfight comp, if you move as 5, no one can get picked. If in solo queue usually your AD carry runs around going for red buff or whatever, then obviously that's an avenue for pick comps to attack that one straggler. But as teamfight comps usually stick together, that's why they beat pick comps on average. On the other side here we have the split push comps. They get beat by the pick comps on most cases, because imagine a 1-3-1 for example. We have a group of people running around the mid and 2 people running around in the side lanes. The team is stretched thin, so much darkness all around the map, and pick comps can, well, look to pick off these stragglers in either the side lanes or even collapse onto people looking for vision to allow these side lane split push. These split push comps have an advantage over poke comps though. Poke comps really love to fire all their projectiles onto a 5 stack and laugh at them and seeing their health bars being diminished. So a split push comp which only has, let's say again in a 1-3-1 scenario, so your poke comp throws your abilities onto the 3 and yeah, maybe they are suffering, but well, you lose the game in the side lanes. So usually split push comps that again make the map wide and open win against poke comps. Not only do poke comps have troubles with answering side lanes, they also obviously profit less from their AoE abilities if they can only hit a smaller number of enemy champions. Poke comps can beat out teamfight comps, and in theory that's how it works, right? A poke comp, well, they group up, teamfight comp groups up, and well, they throw their abilities onto the teamfight comps, AoE long range, and well, that's great business. The obvious problem in some cases is the topic of engage, and well, that's how poke comps can get clapped. They're notorious hard to play, and with that, poke comps are in theory better against team fighting comps, but the topic of engage, positioning, vision control, all of that make them a bit more niche and not really all that recommendable as a full-on team comp, unless you're way better than your opponent. So keeping this power dynamic in mind, let's think again. So RNG, they went for, well, a teamfight comp, right? Mostly team fighting tools. Sure, they have some pick or single target damage tools as well, but mostly it's a full-on brawl skirmish teamfight comp. On the other side, T1, so they don't really have that much split push, but they have Ari, which looks for, well, team fights. They have Yuumi and Wukong, who also look for team fights. And then they have Jace, Jin, who are more in the poke comp. So, well, they're pretty much all over the place, really. They can't even answer the split push of Gwen, if you think about that as well. So, as such, yeah, T1 with their poke tools without protection is getting run down by the team fight. T1's pick is completely useless against RNG's team fight, and as such, in most cases, T1, they might only have like 3, maybe 4 champions that are in a useful spot in any given situation of this game, while RNG has 5 which are always in a great spot and amplifying each other. And as such, even with these identities in mind, T1 is just losing out completely. So now we're coming to part 5 of this long video, and we're coming to the part which we have all waited for. The part where you guys are going to say, wow, this guy, he is so smart, ha ha ha, but he has hindsight. Everyone would have known after the game that this pick is bad, that this blah blah blah. But for that, check my reaction. I made the claims I'm going to make in my live reaction of the finals. So it's not based on hindsight. So coming to the draft now, finally, we're going to keep the bans as they are. Personally, I would agree with banning the Gwen. I think attacking Bin as obviously the weakest player of RNG, and with Zeus being one of the, if not the best performing player on T1 through this MSI, I think this should have been the avenue for T1 to get victories in this series. But hey, we're going to keep the bans throughout this entire draft because, well, we don't want to open that Pandora's box. So Gwen is being elected here as a first pick. We already talked about her strengths, flexible, strong, and so on and so on. So what is T1 about to do here? R1, R2. So we're going to counterpick the Gwen. This is the most straightforward thing that you can do. So obviously, again, Gwen could be flexed, but it is not something that Wei and Zhao really have played. And again, with Gangplank being banned, Gwen then being flexed into another role, Bin would look quite silly. So the preferred counterpick I would expect and want Zeus to play, again considering that he is more of a carry player, would be Jax, right? You could elect something similar scaling like the Vladimir or something like the Ornn. But I think the more 1v1 focused carry style player champion like the Jax would be the best choice for Zeus. Then next, I kinda am torn. So obviously a champion like Lee Sin would be a good pick away here from Wei, and I see arguments for that. Not to mention that Owner is an absolutely insanely Sin player. Personally, I would say probably the best right now, but I would agree with the notion of picking the Wukong. I see no problem with the Wukong pick. I think Lee Sin is a good early game pick against it, and you can argue that Wukong into Gwen is also not that great, but I understand T1's priority on the pick. And again, with T1, I think they're the better team. So as a better team, you should aim for more scaling and more safe and easy to play champions. There's no need to go for a champion like Lee Sin, which has to do something early, which has to outplay. So I think the Wukong, being the easier of the two, is the champion of choice. We're going to assume that the Jax doesn't screw the priorities of the pick ban for RNG. We can obviously discuss now, are they going to pick Lissandra blind? I think there are arguments for that, right? They're not going to pick the Ahri. If they're going to pick the Ahri, they're going to make my life here very easy, because that would be the easiest R3 Lissandra pick I've ever seen in my life. Would they pick the Lissandra here? Would they pick the Galio? Would they pick the Ahri? I don't think the Ahri would be a pick that they should or would go for, right? If we're going to do that here in this simulation, you're all going to say, I'm going to give RNG the bad champions, and we're not going to, we don't want that here. There are arguments for them to pick the Galio here, because T1 is pretty much locked into AD champions, and the standard counter for the Galio, which is the Tristana, or what T1 has shown to be the Tristana, obviously there are others like Corki for example, wouldn't really work too much here. But personally, I think Zhao values the Lissandra quite a lot, as I think he has a 100% win rate with that champion, and obviously Lissandra has panned out to be a very strong champion in this series so far. So I personally think Lissandra should and probably would have been the pick here, although I would understand the argument for a Galio pick here as well. And then T1, in retrospect to this, obviously now top lane is going to be counterpicked. They got counterpicked in the jungle position, so now they have the avenue to attack Lissandra with a counterpick of their own. And I already showed quite a few of them, going from champions like Zoe to to Corki again. But I think, as you need an AP champion here more, I think Zoe is quite risky, because again, she is forced into the cleanse, and that's not really the best summoner spell for Zoe herself. Also, she's easily to be attacked by the mobility and CC, even pre-6 from this mid lane jungle duo, while Wukong himself is not going to offer much in this 2v2. But if we add a more bruiser and a more skirmish heavy champion, like the Sylas for example, I think that would do T1 more well. Sylas also not too reliant on getting something too early. His scaling is actually kind of fine, and he already has a nice chunk of ultimates with good AP ratios to steal. Also, like Lissandra, Sylas is a champion that is valuing an item like the Zhonya's Hourglass quite a lot, so Sylas in a later teamfight can do the Lissandra maneuver of going into the enemy team, ulting himself, and then Zhonya thing for an 4.5 second stasis duration, which is obviously pressuring and zoning on enemy champions. So I think here in this spot, the Sylas has good value. Coming into the next rotation after the bans, again we're leaving them the same. T1, they should pick their AD carry here, because the counter pick of the support has additional value, because supports can obviously fit into a larger variety of champion identities, and the counter pick for bot lane as a 2v2 matchup usually comes through the support position as well. So we're going to pick our AD carry here. And well, there are a few options left after, well, let's say 4 or 5 bans have come through. Looking at the pool available, there are options ranging from Tristana to Aphelios, maybe even to something like a Misfortune. Personally, I think we're going here with the comfort of the Aphelios. Aphelios also has the value of scaling, again, great, comfort, great, laning ability, decent, snowballing potential against turret, also decent, similarly like a Tristana for example, but Tristana's not comfort. But again, a champion like him against RNGs comp is also not too bad, right? Aphelios famously known for shredding through bruiser-like champions that are running into him. Sure, Gwen and the Lissandra can be a bit noisy with their Ws and slows and stuns, but well, that is nearly every champion to every AD carry that is probably not Xayah or has a Tahm Kench next to him. But we're going to talk about Aphelios' partner later on. I think personally RNG, they would have completed their comp in a similar way than what they would have done on stage. The Tristana here fulfills similar needs than in their original comp. The Buster Shot ultimate is a good way to kite away from a Jax and a Sylas potentially if they come too close, and again the DPS, snowball and reset potential that a Tristana also brings with her matches well with the rest of their team. Her range is also quite nice, and explosive potential in the 1v1s and early laning phase against Aphelios also make it a nice matchup. So I think, especially with the bans being as they are, I think Gala would have opted into this matchup. There are arguments again for a Misfortune, which obviously has not too much backline threat yet and has a range advantage, but Misfortune usually not the best champion and not a priority pick Gala goes for. Going for the R5, we have, well, nearly the pick of the litter. Nautilus and Tahm Kench the only supports being banned, and for a guy like Ming, his other support priority pick, the Leona, is still available. So that would have been an option. Leona obviously against Aphelios is a decent choice. Obviously with a range ultimate she can interact with him without getting shredded to pieces. But obviously the Leona ultimate is an easy engage tool for Sylas to steal, which is something teams consider at this level of play. So going for the Leona or the Rakan, which was the choice that they took on stage, would be the way to go. I think I, in their position, would opt in for the Leona because it's also more comfort, which again in a game 5 pressure situation is something we can value quite a lot. Also, Leona here in this case can usually protect and peel the Tristana more from the dive-in threats of the Jax or the Sylas in the skirmishes. So if it's Rakan, if it's Leona, that's going to be up for debate. I personally think here Leona is a bit better, but Leona wouldn't be the greatest pick for T1 side. If you opt in for a blind Rakan pick, there's always the potential of a counter pick Leona, which obviously is something that carrier can play. As such, I think not opting into being easily countered and getting comfort is something that is very nice for them. Also, Rakan and Leona both have a strong level 2 that matches with Tristana's aim to engage their Aphelios early on. So for carrier, there are also a wide variety of champions left available. In this spot, I would look to pick an enchanter. T1 has decent engage tools and surely carrier can double down on that. So in theory, if there's a ranged enchanter support that can bully and help Aphelios and laning phase and can potentially help his team with engaging, that would be really cool. So something like a Renata Glass or a Karma could have been an option here. I think personally, from the preferences we saw at this tournament, Renata should be the pick, obviously also due to her really matching well into RNGs run into you comp. So that is something. Obviously Karma with the movement speed from her mantra shields can help T1 a bit more in an aggressive way, which is something to be of value. But also, as you see here, carrier played the Renata Grass 3 times, which for him is quite a lot, and not a single Karma game, which to be fair was banned a couple of times, but I think a Renata pick here as a 5 pick would make more sense. It amplifies some of the strengths T1 already has in their identity here, and it counteracts some of the things that RNG wants to do. So in the end here, we end up with Gwen facing Jax in the top lane, which is a T1 favorite matchup, which they got through the counter pick. In the mid lane, we have Sylas versus Lissandra. This obviously is up for debate what is going to happen here, with obviously there being a chance for the Lissandra to be a Galio, for example. But in this matchup, they potentially showed their mid laner here rather early, and Sylas could have been an answer. Note that that is obviously one of the highly variables in this simulation here, because for instance, they could have also picked the Kai'Sa here in this spot, or a Galio, or something entirely different, because there was no need to reveal their mid laner now, although the Lissandra would have been a priority pick. That is also quite contested. Remember, the contested pick is something that both teams really want and that both teams really excel at. So that is a bit up to the beta, but I think this is not entirely unrealistic. In the jungle, we have Wukong facing Lee Sin, Wukong being slightly countered obviously due to his power level, but also slightly countered due to the B3 pick in response to the R3. In the AD carry position, we have an Aphelios facing off a Tristana. Obviously, that is Tristana early game focused, but the scaling wise is going to be interesting. Obviously one more single target focused, which fits in with the style of a Leona single target, Lee Sin single target, and a Lissandra also somewhat single target. So that is quite on theme for RNG, and also an early game power play, which matches with their mid and jungle. In the support position, we have Leona facing off Renata Grass, with Renata having a potential counter pick position here. And well, that is also due to the R5 pick obviously coming in. And then, as we already talked about in detail, both of these champions helping their team accomplish what they need to do and being on theme generally. So in this case, I think both teams have a clear cut to victory through skirmishing, through early and more late game team fighting. Both have comeback mechanics through scaling options, or through pick, or through split push, and I think both comps would have been playable. So you finally made it to the outro. Hope you enjoyed me shedding some light into the multiple facets of drafting, but also how T1 fucked up, how RNG, intentionally or not, did some really nice thing in this last game. If you enjoyed this quite different video to my usual stuff, let me know. If you have more drafts from this MSI potentially that we can check out. Maybe not in that much detail though, but let me know in the comments down below. I have linked the how to draft playlist in the description, so check out these older videos if you want to know about some concepts in more details. But that's going to be it. Thanks for watching, stay well, and see you around, my friends.